Now we're beginning the topics of motivation and emotion covered on quiz 8. And first, motivation. This is a topic area that has been lessening in popularity over the years. You see fewer and fewer courses at universities and colleges that are titled motivation. I personally have seen shorter chapters on motivation in general psychology textbooks over years. And basically, that's because psychologists have so many different theoretical perspectives as they attempt to explain behavior. When you say the word motivation, I think most people know what it means. We're basically looking for causes of behavior. And depending upon your theoretical perspective as a psychologist, you're going to identify different factors as causes. Some theorists over the years, however, have attempted to come up with all encompassing theories of motivation, but this has not been hugely successful. We're going to talk about three of these: drive reduction, optimal levels of arousal theory, and very briefly, opponent process theory, and discuss the problems with each. But again, while there's some important concepts to discuss in the context of motivation, it is lessening in terms of its popularity as a college course. First, drive reduction theory. A drive is defined as an unpleasant physiological state that motivates an organism to reduce it. So we might think of a drive as hunger, and hunger motivating an organism to reduce that unpleasant physiological state, thereby motivating eating. Or thirst as a drive for behavior, causing an organism to drink fluids. While this makes intuitive sense and is consistent with our daily language, there are some serious problems with drive reduction theory. For some psychologists, not all, and probably not even most psychologists, a drive is a hypothetical construct, and some psychologists do not use hypothetical constructs to explain their behavior. For instance, followers of B.F. Skinner, a radical behaviorist, tended to try to understand behavior just in terms of stimuli and responses. And the organism itself was viewed as a black box. And inside the black box, there may be emotions or feelings or thirsts or drives, but they cannot be directly measured. If something cannot be directly observed or measured, then it's not useful as an explanation of behavior, according to Skinner and his followers. So that's not a criticism that's universal for psychologists. Instead, consider this. Drive reduction theory is based on circular reasoning. Basically, you're using a label for behavior to explain the behavior. Imagine having a dog, and your dog goes over and drinks out of its water bowl. Someone asks you, why is the dog doing that? And you say it's because the dog's thirsty. And then they ask you, well, how do you know it's thirsty? And you say it's because they're drinking out of the water bowl. This is circular. It's not explaining behavior. For instance, it's not indicating anything about the physiological mechanisms involved. Instead, you are using the observation of a behavior to explain a behavior. Again, why is the dog doing that? Because it's thirsty. How do you know it's thirsty? Because it's drinking water. And it's circular. Circular reasoning is a very serious error of logic. Other psychologists have criticized drive reduction theory because they believed it required one to postulate an infinite number of drives to explain all behavior. For everything a human or non-human does, is there a drive that causes that behavior? Here are a couple of examples, my favorite ones. I read a research study that I enjoyed reading about a monkey that was in a little room, and it had to press a lever many, many times to open a little window, and when it did that, it could look through the window at an electric train going around the railroad tracks, a toy electric train. So do monkeys have a drive to watch, excuse me, little toy electric trains. Another example, this has to do with behavior modification, a topic for later in the semester when we talk about abnormal psychology and therapeutic practices. But I read a clinical case study once that took place at a residential hospital, and a particular individual there really enjoyed making beds. It was his favorite activity. He just loved to go get the sheets and the pillowcases and the blankets from the staff, and then he would make the beds, and that was his absolute favorite thing to do. On the other hand, he truly, truly hated taking baths. And at that time, it took several staff members to use force to get him to bathe. So psychologists came along, decided to try to help the staff at this institution. They used the pre-med principle, and they made it so that in order to be able to make beds, this particular individual had to take his bath without force. And it worked. He was much easier to interact with from that point on, and the pre-med principle, as usual, worked just fine. But you'd have to ask, in the context of drive reduction theory, is there a drive for bed making? And I think most of us would say no. So drive reduction theory, not a popular theory anymore, and with some pretty serious problems. I think the most serious of which has to do with the fact that it's based on circular reasoning. Next, I want to talk about optimal levels of arousal theory. This too is not as popular as it once was, and for very good reasons. According to optimal levels of arousal theory, we and other animals do what we do in order to maintain an optimal level of arousal. So the idea is that if a situation is too arousing, then we avoid it. And if a situation is not arousing enough, then we avoid it. And instead, we seek out situations that are of an optimal level of arousal. The classic illustration of this that you see in general psychology textbooks involves what happens if you're standing at a sink and washing dishes, or somehow using water from your faucet. What do? We tend to change the temperature constantly. I personally tend to make the water warmer and warmer as I adapt to the temperature. And the explanation for this, according to some, is that this maintains an optimal level of arousal. I don't think this is the most satisfactory illustration, so I'm going to try another one. Imagine the activities that you enjoy, the things that you do. It may be that your favorite activities are to interact with friends. You prefer being with people that are interesting and not threatening, and certainly not boring. So according to optimal levels of arousal theory, sitting in a class or listening to an audio tape or talking to someone who's not the most interesting person in the world is not going to attract you. And it does not maintain an optimal level of arousal. So it's not a situation that you would willingly seek out. On the other hand, if you know people that are just for some reason threatening, or they stand too close to you and make you uncomfortable, or maybe even watching a very, very, very scary movie, those are situations that, again, are not going to maintain an optimal level of arousal. So you would avoid them and seek out other situations that would do that. Optimal levels of arousal theory can be criticized because it's based on circular reasoning, not unlike drive reduction theory. With optimal levels of arousal theory, if you think about it, you observe a behavior, someone asks you, why is that person doing that? You say, in order to maintain an optimal level of arousal. But how do you know that's an optimal level of arousal? And you can only answer because that's what that person is doing. So why is that person doing that? In order to maintain an optimal level of arousal. How do you know it's an optimal level of arousal? Because that's what they're doing. It's circular, and it does not really explain behavior. Last, I wanted to just briefly mention opponent process theory. This was a theory that came out in about 1980. and you can look it up and learn more about it if you want to. At the time, it was pretty exciting because it explained some types of behaviors that were neglected by other motivational theories. For instance, it explained why some people engage in daredevil sports or extreme sports, as they're called today. It explains how drug addiction occurs. And here's the basic idea: there are two opposing processes in the central nervous system, according to this theory. And one of them is unchanging, but the other can change with repeated experiences. And one is positive, one is negative, and your experience of any situation is the result of the combined effects of those two types of processes. And this is more than you need to know for a quiz, but basically, because there's a process that changes, and in this situation it would be negative, that would explain why it takes more and more of a drug to get a person high compared to the first time they took a drug. Opponent process theory for motivation is not a popular theory today, and it has been questioned in terms of whether or not there's a physiological basis for this theory. On the other hand, some approaches to the topic of motivation have proved useful to psychologists. Some psychologists are interested in regulatory processes, or those processes that help us maintain a healthy physiological state. And here you have a very important vocabulary term, homeostasis. You saw it once before when we were talking about the biological foundation. But homeostasis is defined as an organism's tendency to maintain an optimal level of any physiological requirement. And when you think of the word homeostasis, I want you to always think of another word that starts with H, and that is hypothalamus, because the hypothalamus is very much involved in our homeostatic functioning. It's involved in our eating behavior, our drinking behavior, temperature regulation of our bodies, and so on. All of these are important regulatory processes. In fact, if you destroy certain parts of the hypothalamus in laboratory rats, then those rats will lose large amounts of weight and reduce their eating. Damage to other parts of the hypothalamus in laboratory rats will cause rats to eat larger amounts than normal and become very obese. Still, other parts of the hypothalamus are monitoring our body's fluids, and when there is a drop in fluids in our cells, then through mechanisms that are quite complex and not fully known, then we will engage in activities, or our body will respond in ways to replenish fluids or to conserve fluids. Furthermore, many psychologists have found it helpful to look at these regulatory processes as involving negative feedback systems. So I want to explain what a negative feedback system is using an example that is already familiar to you in your home. I want you to think of your home's thermostat and heating unit. This is a negative feedback system. Basically, there's a thermostat in some room or rooms of your home, and you set the desired temperature on that thermostat. And that desired temperature, in these terms, would be called the set point. And the thermostat is monitoring the environment in your home. And when the temperature falls below that set point, then an error signal is sent to a heating unit, which generates heat. And the thermostat, which is still monitoring the room temperature, will turn off the heater when the room temperature rises to the set point again. This is a negative feedback system. Basically, an event feeds back on itself in a negative, self-controlling way. Now, in terms of our physiology and our regulatory processes, let's take fluids. The hypothalamus is monitoring the fluids in our body at any particular time, and when those fluid levels drop below the set point, the optimum, then error signals are sent out to different parts of the body, and through some of these mechanisms, we will go get a drink of water. Through others of these mechanisms, we will actually conserve the fluids in our bodies. I don't want to be disgusting, but when you wake up in the morning, I'm a biologist, we talk about these things. When you wake up in the morning, your urine tends to be very concentrated and darker colored and to have a stronger smell compared to later in the day when you've had the opportunity to ingest water. You've gone overnight with any fluid ingestion, and so your body works to conserve fluids under those circumstances. And we can think of that as occurring as a negative feedback system. And the fact that the body has multiple ways to maintain that optimal level of fluids is evolutionarily adaptive. It is for these types of processes that are so important for our survival. It's evolutionarily adaptive that there be multiple ways for corrections to occur or multiple corrective mechanisms. Just to help you understand negative feedback systems a little better, let's talk about positive feedback systems for a moment. In a positive feedback system, an event is not feeding back on itself in a self-controlling way. The best example of a positive feedback system that I've ever encountered was a commercial that used to be presented on television years ago. And it showed a white room and a man in a business suit. And the man was walking in a circle in the center of the room. And he was saying to himself, I need to work harder so that I can make more money so that I can buy more cocaine. I need to take cocaine so I can work harder so I can make more money so I can buy more cocaine. And as he was saying this, he was speeding up in his circles around the room until obviously the result was a breakdown of the system. And that is what happens with positive feedback systems. The result can be chaos and a breakdown of the system. A more useful approach to understanding motivation is the multiple levels approach, which incorporates multiple theoretical perspectives for understanding behavior. The multiple levels approach includes genetic inheritance, physiological factors, psychological factors, and sociocultural factors. So I want to give you some examples of these various factors. Using body weight as an example, in the context of genetic inheritance, the number of fat cells in our bodies are largely inherited from our parents. At the physiological level, we know that exercise influences the storage of fat in our fat cells. In terms of psychological factors, and of course these are of most interest to some of us, the size of the plate matters. Behavioral modification techniques for changing behavior include a suggestion that if you're trying to lose weight, then just eat off a smaller plate, and that will cue you to do so. Another interesting psychological factor that influences our eating behavior and body weight has to do with time of day. Some of us tend to eat our meals at specific times each day, perhaps 8:30 in the morning, noon, 5, 6 o'clock at night. And we're cued by the clock to go get a meal. Whereas others of us tend to just eat when we're hungry, and the clock really is not cueing us to eat meals to any large extent. Finally, sociocultural factors influence body weight and eating behavior. For instance, people in different cultures eat different types of food items. I remember my mother once telling me that she had sampled chocolate-covered ants, and I was fascinated that she had done so. I never would have guessed she would have done that. And that's perfectly normal as a food item for people in some parts of the world. On the other hand, hamburger is not a food that people in some cultures are going to eat, and some of us in this particular culture do not do so because we're vegetarians. Another sociocultural factor involves cultural standards of beauty. Now, beauty, what is considered attractive in the human form, has changed historically and it varies culturally. 200 years or so in this country, having a more curvaceous body, if you're a woman, was considered much more attractive. Then you had the 1960s with the model Twiggy, and everybody was supposed to be rail thin. Thankfully, we're getting away from that with attractiveness being associated with more diverse types of body shapes for both men and women. And in some cultures today, having a body type that is more curvaceous, or let's just say plumper, it for men and women is considered more attractive. Perhaps it indicates that an individual has some degree of financial stability. So you can see why a multiple levels approach to motivation might be useful, just because it attempts to understand some type of psychological phenomenon based on multiple factors and with multiple approaches.